Final Fantasy XV arrived at the tail end of 2016 after what can only be described as an incredibly tumultuous development cycle. Not only did the name of the game change, something that their fashion designer, Rowan, accidentally revealed a year before the official unveiling at E3 2013, as they changed their credits from saying they were working on Versus XIII to 15, but we also had platform changes, with it going from PlayStation 3 exclusive to a multi-platform release on the PlayStation 4, Xbox One and now PC. We had development staff changes, most notably with the director switching from Nomura to Tabata, and we even had the unfortunate removal of Stella, a prominent character who had already been revealed. And given everything that happened, you'd expect the game to have been something of a train wreck, like we saw with Duke Nukem Forever, but somehow they managed to make it actually pretty good, and it's since become one of the best-selling games in the franchise. As of November 2018, when Square Enix reported that Final Fantasy XV had managed to ship 8.4 million copies worldwide, it was only being surpassed by Final Fantasy X and Final Fantasy VII, but based on rate of sales and the release of episode Ardyn, it's likely that Final Fantasy XV has now moved into that second spot, which is pretty crazy. As you can imagine though, with so much change going on behind the scenes, there are plenty of morsels of information surrounding the creation of the game, as well as hidden details that reside within the final product that you probably aren't aware of, and we're going to be delving into some of them today. The hope is that, as we did with our video around Final Fantasy VIII facts, we've selected things that are insightful on multiple levels beyond just the headline, and that's the main criteria we've tried to base this on. Is there an interesting insight or angle to the wider story? That's why we won't be talking about basic things like, the fact that the clothing was designed by an actual fashion house called Rowan, and that it was made available for purchase at one point, or that Lunafreya actually had 6 different actors play her part. 3 for voice, Lena Headey, Amy Shields and Liliana Chomsky, 2 for motion capture, Amanda Pieri and Bo Bragason, and 2 for likeness, Sonia Malcheva and Bo Bragason again. And that's why our first fact relates to something that, in my opinion, shows just how crazy the development of Final Fantasy XV was and has continued to be, as it relates to how many different cooks have been in the kitchen before and after its release on the 29th of November, as Final Fantasy XV has now had 11 different directors working on the main game. As mentioned, I think we all know that even before the name change, Final Fantasy Versus XIII was having a rather tumultuous development cycle for numerous reasons, and there's no hiding from that. Likewise, it's pretty common knowledge that although Tetsuya Nomura was the original director of Versus XIII and continued in that role after its transition to Final Fantasy XV, Yuichi Wada chose to replace him outright with Hajime Tabata at the end of 2013, even though this wasn't publicly revealed until almost a year later. The game then shipped at the end of 2016, 2 months after Tabata had originally predicted, but after that point, there have been another 9 directors who have stepped into the director's chair for products directly related to the main experience of Final Fantasy XV, the first of which was Kenichi Shida. Having worked as one of the main development managers underneath Tabata on Final Fantasy XV, Tabata felt that Shida was the perfect candidate to step up and oversee the direction of Episode Gladiolus and Episode Prompto, something which then allowed Tabata to focus on Business Division 2's new IP. While Shida was working on this, Takafumi Terada, who had previously been in charge of creating key boss sequences like the fight against Leviathan in the main game, but also within Episode Prompto, was given directorial duties on Episode Ignis, and continued in this role with Episode Ardyn. It's also assumed that Terada would have taken the helm of Episode Aranea, Lunafreya and Noctis, but we can't say for sure in that regard, as the credits are a bit ambiguous. One thing we do know though is that Toru Asanai, who worked alongside Terada on boss battles within Final Fantasy XV, ended up being the scenario director on Episode Ardyn, and he then led the creative direction on the Dawn of the Future novel, providing a framework before passing it on to Jun Ishima to write. Outside of this, as the project was so different from the other pieces of downloadable content, another director was chosen to look after Comrades, the multiplayer expansion. That man was Kazuya Takahashi, who had previously been in charge of creating quests within the main game. Collaboration events also had different directors. It's unclear who directed the Moogle Chocobo Carnival event, but having acted as the lead designer within the buddy system and AI team on the main game, Praset Vijayakarn ended up directing the Assassin's Festival collaboration, which ran towards the latter part of 2017. Praset's co-worker, Sho Igarashi, who also worked within the buddy system and AI team, ended up directing the Terror Wars collaboration questline, and Yaoyi Hattori, who worked alongside Comrades director Kazuya Takahashi within the quest development on the main game, served as the director of the Final Fantasy XIV collaboration line. Outside of that, well, Takatsugu Nakazawa, who worked on the RPG elements in the main game, served as the director of Final Fantasy XV Royal Edition, and Final Fantasy XV Pocket Edition actually had two directors, Takahito Ibato and Takahiro Murakami. They both served as producers on Final Fantasy XV, while Ibato was also part of the designated smartphone app team. Ibato then worked as the sole director for Pocket Edition HD, with Murakami presumably being signed to something else. And if you've kept up, that is a lot of directors. But technically, there are more, as plenty of other directors have also been involved with the Final Fantasy XV universe, starting with Takeshi Nozue, who directed Kingsglaive, and Soichi Masui, who directed every animated episode of the Brotherhood series except Ardyn Prologue, which was instead directed by Kentaro Sugimoto. Takahito Ibato, who directed Pocket Edition, directed Justice Monsters 5, making him the most active director with 3 Final Fantasy XV directorial credits to his name, and Michio Takahashi, who is also part of the Final Fantasy XV smartphone app team, directed King's Knight, Wrath of the Dark Dragon. Monster of the Deep, the VR experience, was directed by Masashi Takizawa, who also worked alongside Royal Edition director Takatsugu Nakazawa on RPG elements. And then there was A King's Tale, a free pre-order game that pretty much came out of nowhere. That was directed by a channel marketing manager from Square Enix North America called Mark Terada. It meant that across the entire Final Fantasy XV universe, there were 18 different directors, potentially 19 if we assume that Final Fantasy XV A New Empire also had a director, which is pretty mental when you think about it. So our next fact relates to Noctis's faithful friend, Ignis Scientia, and some changes that took place to his character even after the game had been rebranded as Final Fantasy XV. On the 10th of June 2013, Square Enix took center stage during Sony's E3 press conference to reveal that Final Fantasy Versus XIII was no more. It was now Final Fantasy XV, and to go along with this, they promised a deluge of new information in the days that followed. And they held true to this promise, as the Chocobros, who up until that point had been kept completely nameless, were identified from their Japanese names as Gladiolus Amicitia, Prompto Argentum, and Ignis Stupio Scientia. The interesting element was that when Ignis was then revealed to the Western audience a few weeks later, his name had apparently been changed. The middle name, which in Latin could be translated as the verb related to being stunned, astounded, or amazed, had been completely dropped. Not only that, but it was then removed from all subsequent Japanese communication with no explanation given. That's not all though, as despite Final Fantasy XV's new art director Yosuke Naora saying that he had to make the fewest changes to Ignis from a visual perspective, his gameplay ended up being quite different from what was initially planned. During the rather extensive 2011 trailer for Versus XIII, the developers decided to show off a decent chunk of gameplay, and it was during this that we got to see Ignis in action, wielding a katana. This was changed though, as in the final product he can only use polearms and daggers, yet those eagle-eyed gamers amongst us will have noticed that he does still use a katana in the final product when attacking as part of an armature chain. And on that note, as an interesting aside here, Core, who ended up being the character who did use a katana as his main weapon within the final game, had his role completely changed. When Final Fantasy XV was announced, he was planned to be the 5th party member who would act as the voice of reason, fulfilling the role of the guiding hand that had previously been played by characters like Auron and Balthier. And although he did still contribute to the narrative in that way within the final game, his role was completely diminished to the point that he was just a supporting member of the wider cast. For our third fact, we're going to be talking about the multiplayer expansion, Comrades, and that it's actually a toned down version of what Tabata had originally envisioned he wanted the main experience of Final Fantasy XV to be. But to fully explain that, we need to go way back, as even when the game was known as Versus XIII, Nomura had spoken numerous times about character switching and the unique mechanics he wanted Ignis, Gladiolus and Prompto to have if you chose to play as them instead of playing as Noctis. The game would still very much be centered around the main character, but as he's now teased with the Final Fantasy VII Remake, Nomura wanted players to experiment and utilize the strengths of other characters to employ different strategies for success. Switching to Prompto, for example, was meant to grant players the ability to manual aim and to target an enemy's weak point. When Tabata took over the project, this wasn't just something he wanted to maintain, he wanted to enhance this mechanic as much as possible. And with that in mind, one of his initial visions for Final Fantasy XV was to expand it to a full-on multiplayer offering, where it wouldn't just be a single player choosing to switch between the characters. Instead, each of the other party members could be controlled by other human players, potentially all around the world, or even locally. It was something which had been previously accomplished within the Crystal Chronicles sub-franchise, but was also seeing a resurgence in popularity due to the likes of Destiny and Monster Hunter 4. And Tabata felt it would help to work along with the game's wider theme of 4 buddies on a road trip. But when they started to plan out the logistics, they realised that it would be very hard to implement within their open world setting. Due to the sheer size of the world, they figured it would have taken hours upon hours to get through simple segments of the game, and so they decided to rein themselves in and revert back to the game being a single player experience. Yuichiro Miyake, who had been hired after finishing up on Demon's Souls and Armored Core 4 from Software, was given the task of making this all seamless. They wanted to ensure that no matter which character the player was controlling, the others would behave in a natural manner that reacted well to their current situation. As Noctis was the main character, they chose to start with Ignis, Gladiolus and Prompto, and Miyake's team did such a good job in this regard that they actually decided to just continue on in that vein. Noctis would become the only playable character, allowing them to play to their creative strengths and enhance the AI characters even further. When they were then deciding on what to actually put in the Season Pass, the idea of resurfacing the multiplayer experience gained traction, and although it was rather toned down compared to Tabata's initial vision, it did still grant players the opportunity to complete quests within the Final Fantasy XV universe alongside other people. Likewise, the ability to switch between party members on the fly was actually added back into the game during a free update that launched alongside episode Ignis. For our fourth fact, we're going to be looking at the origins of Final Fantasy XV's story, and for that, we need to take another trip down memory lane. Now, it's unclear how much of the wider narrative was retained after Hajime Tabata and his team had taken over the project, but one thing's for sure, they certainly did not shy away from making some big changes, and the most apparent in this regard was the removal of Stella Nox Fleuret, a character who had already been announced as having a prominent role within the narrative alongside Noctis. Even still, the new team of Saori Itomuro, Akiko Ishibashi and Takumi Nishida did not make any of these changes lightly, and throughout everything they, along with Tabata, made sure to get the seal of approval from one person in particular, Kazushige Najima, who had been working as the scenario writer on Versus XIII and had fleshed out the original concept, which was created by Tetsuya Nomura. Nomura had been at this point flexing his muscles, having made quite the splash when participating in the writing of Final Fantasy VI, VII and VIII, as well as of course the Kingdom Hearts franchise. And the interesting thing here is that despite Versus XIII being announced in 2006, when they only had a concept to show, the concept was actually much older. When speaking to Gaimaga following the game's announcement, Nomura said, "Absolutely nothing has been done on the actual scenario. However, I've had the plot worked out for some time, so you could say I'm discussing the plot and concept with the staff. However, we've yet to start actual work on the scenario." It means that when people talk about that 10-year cycle of Versus XIII from start to finish, you could actually stretch that out a little bit further if you wanted to, as Nomura had been working on the concept in isolation for a while before it was even announced. And while we're on the subject of changes to the original concept, our next fact relates to a subtle ode that was left in to pay tribute to the biggest cut that we know about, the aforementioned removal of Stella Nox Fleuret from the entire story. Such was the supposed prominence of her role. Following the decision to remove her and slyly replace her with Lunafreya Nox Fleuret, there was immediate backlash from the community, and it wasn't without merit. Even though little had been known about Versus XIII, Stella was something we did know about, and we'd known about for some time, so people had naturally grown attachments. In response to this backlash, the developers were resolute, showing plenty of conviction by literally removing every trace that Stella ever existed. But within the Spanish version of the game, the localization team did manage to sneak something in to pay tribute to the former deuteragonist. It came in the form of an accessory that in the English version is known as the Star Pendant. True to form, it provided the wearer with a resistance to poison as it had done since its first appearance in Final Fantasy VII. But in the Spanish version, it was renamed to the Colgante de Stella, which translates to Stella's Pendant. Subtle indeed. But when you read the description for the item, it becomes a bit less subtle. Within the English version it says, a pendant with a celestial motif protects the wearer from poison. But within the Spanish version of the game, its description translates to roughly saying, a starry pendant that could have belonged to a heroine who was ostracized long ago. We also learnt from a community event that took place in Japan where they revealed a whole host of never been seen concept art that Noctis and Stella were able to communicate by phone, something which was then replaced by the notebook, which leads us on to a fun additional fact relating to said notebook. It was called the Lover's Notebook and was used by Lunafreya and Noctis to perform secret correspondence, something they had done from a young age. The interesting insight is that throughout the game you're able to choose how Noctis responds to Luna's messages, and these responses change the in-game description of the item. If the responses are favourable, it will say that the last pages are stained with tears, while if Noctis is dispassionate, it will say that the notebook is nothing more than a memento now. For our penultimate fact, we're going to be looking at the voice acting, specifically that Ray Chase, the voice actor who was cast as Noctis, almost didn't end up being in the final game. Following on from what you can only imagine would have been a rather rigorous audition process, Ray Chase was successfully cast in the principal role. He would be the voice of Noctis Lucis Caelum. It saw him join the project in an official capacity in September 2014, just as the development team were gearing up for the launch of Episode Duscae, a demo for the game that had just been announced at the Tokyo Game Show and was due to release approximately 6 months later. The primary reason for the demo was to try and connect with the community, to show them that the game was legitimately in development, but it also gave the development team an opportunity to gather some feedback and then respond, which they did during an active time report not too long after the demo had released alongside Type 0 HD. There were, of course, common pieces of feedback that was applicable to all regions, but within North America specifically, there were some serious concerns around Noctis's voice, as many felt he sounded like Batman. After receiving the feedback, the team agreed a month later that they would need to make a change. And due to how the voice acting industry works in Japan, where actors typically only do one type of voice, they felt they would need to recast the role. However, Keith Farley, the voice director of the English version, felt that Ray could deliver on their expectations and decided to give him a chance to prove it by trying different voices. Over the next month, Ray ended up working tirelessly with Keith, Dan Inoue and the production team at Rocket Sound to try and match their new expectations. And as he shared when we interviewed Ray last year, it was a pretty tough time for him, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel. Ray was successfully able to portray a different voice, and he ended up being retained as the voice of Noctis. As a fun aside here, Ray also revealed that he auditioned for the roles of Gladiolus and Ignis. Now, this isn't too interesting in isolation. Voice actors often audition for multiple roles. What is interesting is that in addition to thinking Noctis sounded like Batman, other feedback was that they felt Noctis's initial voice felt like it belonged too much to Gladiolus. And within the Moogle Chocobo Carnival, Ray also got to do a mock voice for Ignis. And so, with that, we move on to our last fact, which relates to some small nuances within the game's ending that were subtly changed when it launched in November 2016. Even though Tabata had always intended to launch Final Fantasy XV in September 2016, as we touched upon within our initial fact, and they then announced to the public that they would hit this target during Uncovered Final Fantasy XV, the game ended up being delayed not too long after so they could add some extra polish, which manifested as a hefty day one patch that clocked in at around 7.2 gigabytes. Naturally, the patch notes for this were pretty extensive as they felt they needed to justify the delay, and so we learnt that the patch contained new cutscenes that couldn't fit on the disc, as well as tweaks to side quests and new gameplay mechanics. But there were some other changes that weren't listed within the patch notes, subtle tweaks to the ending that saw reactions changed. Eagle-eyed gamers noticed that within the original version of the ending, when Lunafreya looked at the photo the player had left behind, her gaze lingered and a tear rolled down her cheek. But within the Crown update, this was changed. The tear was removed, and this was presumably done because the developers felt that it made Luna appear too sad. This wasn't the only change they ended up making though, as within the same patch, Noctis's speech with the Chocobros was also amended to add an additional scene. After the patch, Noctis stands up at the end of his speech and it fades out with different timing, which made it a bit more poignant. So yeah, they were 7 facts about Final Fantasy XV that you probably didn't know, with lots of little bonus facts too thrown in for good measure. But I'm sure there are some amongst you who still knew all of them. And for those of you who are still here, thank you all so much for watching this video until its conclusion. Let us know in the comments below which fact you found to be the most interesting, and of course, if you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. I'd also love to give a massive shout out to the Mox Squad, our group of supporters on Patreon and via YouTube memberships that continues to grow and grow. We try our best to create high quality Final Fantasy content, and it wouldn't be possible without your support. If you'd like to join us on our journey, you can support us on Patreon for just $1 per month, but we have a few different tiers available depending on what level of access you'd like, ranging from discussions around what we're working on through to behind the scenes content. If you want to know more, check out the link in the description below. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. I will see you next time for more Final Fantasy videos.